black people's job to educate you.
Hi, and welcome to Threat Level X. I am your host, the Rage Hammer. Tonight is a miniature podcast, and I'm not going to be going into great depth or exposition on Marx or Hegel or the dialectic. And if you listen to these podcasts, it's either a disappointment or a relief. It's probably a relief. So what I am going to talk about tonight is the current state of affairs around the election and the uncertainty as to who will be sworn in come January 2021. And those who listen to this podcast do so on 3 or 4 major platforms. One is YouTube, but the way that I promote this podcast is through Gab and MeWe and Minds. I've considered developing channels for BitChute and Rumble, but their interfaces remain a bit unreliable in my opinion, and so I haven't. But on platforms like Gab and MeWe and Minds, people are definitely awake and aware of the mountains of information about election fraud and vote fraud in key states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, as well as Nevada. And I personally dug into the data sets of every publicly available poll I could find the week before the election. And what I found after adjusting for oversampling was that Donald Trump would win by a landslide. I predicted he'd get in the range of 320 electoral votes. My methodology was the same in 2016 when I predicted Trump would win and get over 300 electoral votes, and he did. And I predicted that he'd win by 3 million votes as well, but he didn't, and that raised my eyebrow at the time because I did not buy that Hillary Clinton would win the popular vote based on the statistical analysis that I had done. I went back and rechecked, and I still believe her margin in the popular vote was the result of some sort of electoral shenanigans, but it was a moot point, and nobody cared at the time because Trump won the Electoral College, and therefore he won the presidency. My point in highlighting this is that I believe that Trump was the victim of massive fraud in 2016 as well, but the Democrats and the establishment Republicans didn't deploy their efforts competently and managed to lose anyway because they didn't target Michigan and Wisconsin. This time, Democrats were ready. First, you have the entire fake pandemic that was a media-manufactured, Democratic-promoted psyop. It was also the means by which mail-in voting became a determining factor in 2020. Now, COVID doesn't fit the definition of a pandemic on any level. It never has, and it never will. Fatality rates as advertised by the CDC and media outlets were drastically wrong, and it's not that they were in error either. This was always about getting rid of Trump. First, they manufactured a panic in the form of a public health scare. Second, they wrecked the economy with that public health scare and the shutdowns. Third, they utilized the public health scare to argue that ballots should be cast by mail without signature verification or identity verification of any sort. To understand what happened, you have to realize that election officials in many states were mailing ballots to whoever, wherever, without regard for whether or not voters actually lived at a particular address. Now, Democrats and their co-conspirators in the establishment GOP were ready with a surplus of ballots, and they were ready to dump those ballots en masse the day after the election when Americans who voted in person had already cast their ballots. This way, they knew how many votes they'd need to overcome Trump's margin. Now, how do we know that there was fraud? For starters, we absolutely know that ballots were mailed to dead people and returned. And those people didn't obviously vote, they're dead. This is a matter of record. It's been advertised on Tucker Carlson and various other media outlets. Additionally, we note that vote machines in Antrim County were flipping votes from Trump to Biden. That's in Antrim County, Michigan. That was also publicized. We know that the poll observers in Wayne County, Michigan reported irregularities in the form of out-of-state vehicles showing up at 3 a.m. the day after the election with thousands of ballots. We know that those same observers reported being obstructed in their efforts to observe. They were told to stay back if they were Republican poll observers, while their Democratic counterparts were allowed to talk to those who were tallying votes. Now, we know that the Democrats lost seats in the House to the point of nearly losing their majority in an election that pollsters predicted would yield a net gain of at least a dozen seats for Democrats. And to believe that Joe Biden won, you have to believe that voters hammered his party in Congress while switching their votes from Republican congressional candidates to a Democratic nominee. It's idiotic. They didn't do that. We also know that Democrats weren't able to flip the Senate on election night either. We also know that there were over 100,000 ballots in multiple states that contained votes for the presidential race alone, in no other race. And those ballots were overwhelmingly cast for Joe Biden. This is true in Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. We absolutely know from the facts that something doesn't add up and that Joe Biden did not win the election through legally cast votes. Like, the Democratic argument can be summed as, who are you going to believe, us or your own eyes? And what's even more troubling is that in the aftermath of this election, we've seen the incompetence of the Trump administration laid bare. Trump's biggest problem right now is that he doesn't have competent attorneys handling his efforts to contest the election results. He has culture warriors and television wags. There's a difference between those types and actual attorneys, and that difference is effectiveness. Every day we see Trump's attorneys starting, abandoning, and then restarting efforts to contest election results in Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and elsewhere. And so what we're seeing is Trump's attorneys are fighting election fraud the same way the United States fought Vietnam. They're fighting to run out the clock or to consume as much time as possible without actually winning. And worse still, we see these attorneys keep making fantastical claims about German servers, about raids on those servers, and how they have enough proof already to overturn the election, or they have proof positive that Dominion voting system machines and softwares flip the election results, but the proof is always going to be released in the future, never today, never right now. The Kraken doesn't wait. If you unleash the Kraken, you unleash the Kraken. You don't wait 2 days to do it. You don't want 3 days to do it. You don't wait the coming weeks. There's a method behind this, and it's a simple method to see. If these attorneys can stonewall and draw this election out into December, the election results will be certified regardless of whether or not they are fraudulent, and Joe Biden will be declared the president-elect. Now, we have Bush versus Gore to thank for that, because in that case, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that it was more important to meet a deadline to certify election results than it was to find out who really won in Florida, and therefore who really won the presidential election. Now, what Donald Trump does not seem to realize is that his legal team isn't providing him with honest or competent service. I don't believe for a second that it was an accident when Rudy Giuliani held a press conference in front of the Four Seasons Total Landscaping service instead of the Four Seasons Hotel. I don't believe it was accidental that Giuliani spent his time in court the other day making specious, off-the-wall arguments invoking JFK and Mickey Mouse. Rudy Giuliani is a Bush stooge. He always has been, and he always will be. And the reality is that Donald Trump can't retain competent representation or help because of what happened to Paul Manafort and others who helped him in 2016. Every bit of that Mueller investigation and its prosecutions was payback for those who assisted Trump in defeating Hillary and the establishment that she represented in 2016. It was meant to be a deterrent, and it has been a deterrent. And so what we're seeing is unprecedented on every level. And if Donald Trump does somehow pull it out, it will be an absolute act of God. It will not be due to the clown show we've seen so far by Trump's attorneys, many of whom ought to be disbarred for their incompetence. Assuming Trump is sworn in January, it's still not going to be over. For those of us who have witnessed the Marxists in the Democratic Party and the establishment GOP spend 4 years sabotaging this country and obstructing its president, it will be time to recognize reality. Number one, Democrats and establishment Republicans need to be eliminated. They are globalist, and globalists are always Marxist. The efforts of both Democrats and establishment Republicans have clearly been directed at bringing about the collapse of America in order to bring about a one-world government. That's the reason behind the 40 years of massive deficits, ballooning debt, neglecting our infrastructure, inciting a panic and an economic implosion with COVID. Number two, we're not going to eliminate Democrats and House establishment Republicans at the polls. We're not going to get rid of Marxists with an election. We have to physically go into our institutions and take our schools back, our colleges and universities back, our local and state government back. We have to identify and eliminate those within our government bureaucracies who subscribe to and promote Marxism. We have to drive them out of our churches and seminaries. Number 3, we have to strike at the root. And the root of American Marxism has always been the American elites, the people in the 1%. These are the people who have funded the academics, the think tanks, the nonprofits, the activists, the sedition and outright treason of the Marxist and the Democratic Party and the establishment of the Republican Party. These are the people who come with their hands out after they wreck the economy for a bailout. Number 4, we have to deplatform those who have tried to deplatform us. That means de-investing in Facebook, Twitter, Google, and other big tech firms. It means demanding antitrust prosecutions that follow through to the end and shatter these companies into a billion pieces or burn them to ashes. It means getting off of their platforms, refusing to do business with them or through them, and it means building our own platforms with social media and web hosting services. Number 5. Additionally, this means a full frontal assault on the 6 major media conglomerates whose 232 media executives determine what 280 million Americans receive as news and information. If you didn't see the harm in media monopolies and consolidation before 2020, watching the media carry more water for Joe Biden than Gunga Din ought to convince you that big media needs to be broken into a million pieces or burned to ashes ASAP. Number 6, we have to identify and target every individual who actually voted for Biden, who supported radical Marxist organizations like Emily's List, Black Lives Matter, Code Pink, Act Blue, the Tide Foundations, and others. And we have to delist them. They have to be fired, evicted, blacklisted, and ostracized. We need to drive them out of our society once and for all without mercy or hesitation. They need to be stigmatized. They need to be social outcast. If Joe Biden is allowed to take office due to election fraud, he is not a legitimate, legally elected president. We need to remove him and his enablers by any and all means necessary, and we need to do these 6 action items that I just outlined. We have faced an existential threat in Marxism for well over a century, and our mistake was thinking that Marxism fell with the Soviet Union. It did not. All of their infiltrators remained in our colleges, our universities, schools, media outlets, bureaucracies, and especially in our wealthy shareholder class that funds this garbage. These people are traitors, and they need to be dealt with as such no matter who takes office in January 2021. This has been Threat Level Hex, and I am your host, the Rage Hammer.